In this tutorial video, I'll be showing you how to create a Discord moderation bot. This will be a basic moderator bot for Discord and will mainly look at the moderation of user messages. So for example, if someone swears or uses profanity, then they should be warned and eventually banned if they don't stop. We'll also be using databases to store the amount of warnings that each user has per server. If you haven't watched the discord.py setup video, then I encourage you to watch it first, which you can do by clicking the icon at the top right of the video. Otherwise, you may find yourself a bit lost during the tutorial. Before we start, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my other social media to see the projects that I'm currently working on. Please also consider supporting my Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description. But enough of that, let's go create a Discord moderator bot. This is more or less where we left off last time. Make sure that the only event handler you have is the onReady handler. I mentioned earlier that we'll be using a database to store the amount of warnings that each user has on a given server. First of all, what is a database anyway? A database is a collection of data that's distributed in one or more files. The reason we use databases is so that all data is in one place and so that we can easily get access to this data whenever we need it. Whenever someone uses profanity, our bot should detect that and then it should store the user's ID inside of the database, along with the number of warnings and the server where this occurred. In this video, we'll be using a warning count of 3 before a user gets banned, but this can easily be changed. The reason we also store the server is because the user might be on multiple servers with the same bot, and we don't want the user to be banned on all other servers, only the specific server where the user broke the rules. When a user gets 3 warnings, that user should only be banned on the server where the rules were broken, not all servers. I've made an example table to illustrate the idea. This is what our database could look like. You'll see that user number 1 is stored twice, but that's because this user is inside of 2 servers, and each server has its own warning count for this specific user. So if the user were to break the rules on server 1, then that would be 3 warnings, and they should be banned on server 1 only. So at the end, we know that we should ban user 1 on server 1 because they have 3 or more warnings. Another thing to note is that we'll be using SQL, which is a type of coding language that's used to retrieve information from a database. Imagine you have a database with thousands of entries. In order to retrieve the correct entries from the database, we need to write an SQL query to search for the exact row of information that we want. In order to work with the database, we need to make a new import. We'll import SQLite 3, which will allow us to handle all the database operations, and it will allow us to write SQL queries to retrieve the needed information from the database. Before we write any Discord related code, we'll first write some code that will help us work with the database. I'll create a function called createUserTable, which will basically just create a table in our database. There's a difference between the database itself, the tables, and the rows of data. In a database, all the rows of data are stored in tables, and those tables are then stored inside of the database. Tables are used to categorize data. So for example, if you own a grocery store, you could have an employees table that stores each employee in the store. All the employees would have their own row under the table. You could then also have a sales table which stores each sale that the store has made, and each sale would be stored as a row. A third table could be stock, which stores all the product you have, and each product you have in stock would be a row under this table. In our database, we only have one table, and it will be called users per guild. Each row in our table will have 3 values, which will be the example I used a bit earlier. We'll store the user ID, the number of warnings that the user has, along with the guild ID where the user has received these warnings. Additionally, we'll only store users that have 1 or more warnings. Otherwise, we need to unnecessarily store each user across each server where the bot resides, and that'll only take up unnecessary space. This means that every time a user uses profanity, we first need to check if they even have a record in our database. If not, we create their record with a warning count of 1. If they are in the database, however, then we just increase their warning count by 1. Every time you want to work with a database using SQLite 3, you need to create a connection to the database, and we can do this using the SQLite3.connect function. This code will try to connect to the database we specify here, but if it can't find this database file, then it will create one for us. Our database will be the file that this line of code creates. The only issue is this code might store our database in a folder different to the one where the Python file is stored, but I would like for the database to be stored in the same folder as the Python file. Otherwise, our database is going to be stored very inconsistently. In order to fix this, we need to write this code at the top. This will store the path to the folder where our Python file resides. We can then go ahead and change this line of code like this. This will prepend the path to our database so that it can get stored in the same folder as our Python. So let's go ahead and run the code. As you can see, it is now stored inside of the same folder. SQL code can also be used to create tables in our database, so that's exactly what we're going to do. But in order to execute SQL code in our database, we need to first create a cursor object. This object will execute any SQL code that we write. We can now finally create the table using SQL. And this is what that looks like. Cursor.execute is the function we use to write SQL code. The yellow part is the SQL itself. This code is saying that a table should be created if it doesn't already exist. The table should be called users per guild. This table should have 3 columns, which will be user ID, warning count, and guild ID. All of these columns will store integers. This means all of them will store numbers. In Discord, every user has a unique number ID associated with them. The same applies for the servers. Warning count will also be a number, obviously. This part at the bottom that says primary key will select both user ID and guild ID as the primary key. A primary key is a unique identifier that should be used to uniquely identify a row in our database. In our case, since we might store the same user twice or the same server twice, we make the primary key a combination of the two, because we'll never find the same user and the same server in one table. At least one of them will always differ from the rest. So if you add them together, then you can uniquely identify each row in our table. In most cases, however, you'll probably find that most tables in databases only have one primary key and not a combination. In our case, it's convenient to just make the primary key a combination of the two. We can then commit all the changes made to the database and close the connection. Make sure to call this function as well. If we run our code, we should see the database file appear in the same directory as the Python file. But you should notice that we can't really look at the content of the database. We need to use another program to actually look at the database itself. We'll do this a bit later, but for now, just know that the table we created is now stored inside of the database file. The table itself is still empty though, because we haven't stored any data yet. Now that our table is created, I can explain how we're going to implement the rest of our program. We're going to be using the onMessage event handler to check every message that gets sent on Discord. If we then detect any form of swearing or banned terms, we're going to query our database and add a warning to the user. We're then going to look at how many warnings this user has, and if they have 3 or more, then they get banned or kicked from the server. Before we do the actual profanity detection, let's handle the database side of things first. I'm going to add another function at the top here, and I'm going to call it increase and get warnings. This function will take both the user ID and the server or guild ID as arguments. This function is going to do exactly as the name states. It's going to increase the given user's warning count on the given server, and then it's going to return that number back to us so that we can check if it's higher than or equal to 3. First, we need to create the connection and instantiate a cursor object, exactly like before. Before anything else happens, we need to check if the user is already in the database. We can do this by executing the following query. This query is basically saying, get the warning count from the users per guild table that have the user ID and guild ID that we passed into the parameters of this function. The question marks here are placeholders. And then here, we're specifying what should be used instead of the question marks. This first question mark will take user ID and the second will take guild ID, because that's what we specified in the brackets here. When we pass arguments into the SQL query like this, it's important to do it the way we did. Otherwise, your query could be subject to SQL injection. SQL injection is a type of hack where users can gain access to your database, and that's obviously super bad. If you do your queries like this, then you shouldn't really have anything to worry about. This query is going to retrieve the warning count of the user that has a matching user ID and guild ID that we passed into the argument. To actually get this result, we need to store it in a variable and use cursor.fetch1, which will only retrieve the first row of the result. The query should just return one result anyway, but just to be safe, I'm using fetch1. You might have realized that we haven't committed this query like we did the previous one. This is because it's only necessary to commit queries that change the structure or data inside of the database. Retrieving information doesn't really affect the database at all. We're simply just searching for data, not changing it. This result variable will now store one of two things: either the number of warnings or an object called none, which means nothing. If it stores none, then it means the database doesn't have any entry for this specified user and server. So let's handle the case where the result is none first. We'll check if result is none, after which we need to execute another query where we're going to add the user to the database along with the server where the profanity took place. This is what the query looks like. All we're doing is inserting the user into the users per guild table, and then we're doing the thing with the question marks again. We then need to commit this request because we're changing the database by inserting a new entry. You can go ahead and close the connection and return 1. We're safe doing this because we already know the new user is going to have a warning count of 1, so returning the value 1 should be sufficient. Outside of the if statement, we can assume that the user is indeed stored inside of the database. So let's update their warning count by adding 1. The following query is going to update the entry inside of users per guild where the user ID and guild ID match our description given in the brackets below. The first question mark is the new warning count, which should be the old value plus 1. The reason we use square brackets here is because result actually stores a tuple of one item. So we need to access the item inside of the tuple. The second and third question marks are just the user and guild IDs. We can then commit the request, close the connection, and return the result we got earlier. But remember to add a plus 1 because result stores the old value before it was updated. Wow, we covered a lot about databases now. And trust me, we're almost done. But let's just make sure this function actually works. The next few lines of code isn't necessary because I'm only using it to test, but I'm going to call the function 4 times. 2 of them share the same user ID, but they're on a different server. And 2 of them are on the same server, but they're different users. When we run this code and it gives no errors, we should be able to safely assume that nothing went wrong. But we can actually double check by looking inside the database. Now, the only issue is you usually need other software to look at the contents of the database. The software I use is called DB Browser, and I'll very briefly show you how to use it to view the database we just created. Okay, so the software we're going to use for browsing the database is called DB Browser for SQLite. You can get it on this website here if you go to the download tab here. So back in the code, I'm actually going to delete this database just in case, and then I'm going to run this again because I've added a new line right here, which is going to add a warning to an existing user. Let me go search DB Browser. There we go. I've already installed it, but the setup should be pretty easy. Could try just dragging this over here, but that never works for me. So I'm going to right click here, reveal in File Explorer, and then that's what usually works if I drag it from File Explorer itself, not Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to drop this. I'm going to make this full screen actually. Here's the table we created, so we finally have some confirmation that it worked. If we go to browse data though, this is what we're interested in. We have all our users on all the servers here. That user that had 2 lines of code has 2 warnings, meaning that the warning count works. Alright, so I've closed DB Browser and I'm actually going to stop running the bot now. I'm also going to delete this database file because I don't want that to interfere with the rest of the program. I don't want the existing entries to stay there. So yeah, I'm also going to delete these lines. Okay, now it's time for the actual profanity handling of the video. Let's create a list of terms that we're going to label as profanity. The first one, poo-poo. The second, N-word. And the third is a word that I like to think I made up myself, only to find it everywhere on Urban Dictionary. Splorge. You can obviously put in your own terms and words, but this is what I'm choosing. Every time someone sends a message on the Discord server, the bot is going to check if it contains any of these terms. And then it's going to delete the message and give the user a warning, which also means the warning count is going to increase inside the database. Let's change the onMessage event handler. We'll use a for loop to go through every item in our profanity profanity list, and then we'll check if the term's lowercase form is inside of the message's lowercase form. Inside of this if statement, we can assume that the user used one of these banned terms, so we can, first of all, retrieve the number of warnings that this person has, as well as increase it. We obviously do this using the function we made earlier. Now we need another if statement, one that checks if the number of warnings is equal to or higher than 3. If the user has exceeded the number of warnings allowed, then we want to ban them using the .ban method. This method takes a parameter called reason, where we can specify the reason the user got banned. Mine will be exceeded 3 strikes for using profanity. This next line of code is optional, but we can then publicly specify to the server that the user has been banned. We can do this with the following line of code. This is how the bot sends messages. In our else statement, we'll send another message where we give the number of warnings that the user has used. Outside of this, we'll delete the message and then break the loop because we've already found profanity in the message. No need to look any further. Outside of the for loop, we have to write this line of code, which just allows other commands to process before continuing. That should really be it for our bot. We can go ahead and test it. Okay, before I want to run the bot, I actually just want to come here and press tab just once, because there's a good reason. This code here, when they do ban a user, they actually already delete the messages, but then it tries to delete the message again when this was originally here. So that causes an error. The bot still runs, but it causes an error which just, it doesn't look nice, and obviously if there's an issue you want to fix it. So yeah, just something small. But I'm going to run the code now, and then the database was created and the bot is online. So let's go to Discord and you can see the bot's online. I've created a bit of a setup here. I made an alternative account which I'm just going to use to test the bot. So on this server, I'm going to go, also I made 2 servers so we can test the banning. Here I'm going to type poo-poo, N-word, and then that's 2 out of 3 warnings, and then splorge. So I should be banned now. There we go. I've been banned on that server. Let's go to the other one and just try to get 1 warning, N-word. There we go. Right, so 1 out of 3 warnings now. I'm going to switch accounts just so I can get a variation of users as well. On this one, I'm going to say poo-poo, doesn't really matter which one I use. On this one, I'm going to say N-word. There we go. So now that should be a good variety of tests. Let's go to DB browser, and then of course we have to do it from here, File Explorer, not the other one. And there we go. So as you can see, we did have 1 ban, which is clearly this one because it has a warning count of 3. So it was on this server here, and it was this user. I'm not sure if I can show this information publicly. I probably can. Okay, so we can confirm that all of this is valid. Let's go back to VS Code. And we didn't get any errors, so that's good. Everything's working, so that's perfect. I'm going to stop the bot now. That's it for the Discord moderation bot. Thank you so much for watching. I hope the video helped. If you enjoyed and would like to support me, then please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my other social media to see what other projects I'm currently working on. Please also consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks again for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.